Math 1332, Chapter 3, Symbolic Logic, Section 4, Logical Arguments, Video 5, Common Valid Argument Forms, the Law of Contraposition. Now this one you may not know intuitively like you might have known the Law of Detachment, but I think you can probably see through it as well. Can you draw a conclusion from these premises? Premise number 1. If it is raining, then I will open my umbrella. Premise number 2. I did not open my umbrella. Can you draw a conclusion? Did you conclude that it's raining outside? If it's raining, then I'll open my umbrella. Not going to open my umbrella. Conclusion? Because it's not raining? Did you draw that conclusion? This is actually a valid conclusion. But notice it's not the law of detachment. And let me show you what I mean by that. The law of detachment has a very specific form. We don't have the conclusion written in here, so give me 1 second to insert the conclusion. All right, I inserted the conclusion in the argument, but I wanted to point out that this is not the law of detachment. To be the law of detachment, whatever your antecedent is here in the first premise, it would have to match the second premise, which it clearly doesn't. And on top of that, whatever the consequent is in the first premise should match the conclusion of the argument, which it clearly doesn't. So it's not the law of detachment, even though it starts with an if-then statement. At the end, you'll notice that many of these common argument forms start with a conditional. So you can't just look at it and go, there's a conditional, this must be such and such. But we can make this the law of detachment by taking advantage of something we saw in a previous video from the previous series, previous section of the book. Because we can use the contrapositive. Now I want to remind you how the contrapositive works. The contrapositive says if you have a conditional, an if-then statement, you can form a logically equivalent statement by forming the contrapositive, which means that you take both halves of the statement, negate them, and switch them. So what would the contrapositive of this first premise be? In other words, what would this if-then statement sound like if I negated both the antecedent and the consequent and then reversed them and said the consequent after the word if, or rather the negation of the consequent after the word if? It would sound something like this. If I did not open my umbrella, then it is not raining. Remember, for the contrapositive, you take the conditional, negate both halves, and then switch the order. So if it is raining, then I will open my umbrella. If I didn't open my umbrella, then it's not raining. Because a conditional is logically equivalent to its contrapositive, replacing the conditional with its contrapositive won't affect the validity of the argument. Meaning, if the argument's going to be valid with the contrapositive, then it would have been valid with its original conditional. Now, if we were to bring in the other premise, which was I did not open my umbrella, and the conclusion, which was it is not raining, now it's the law of detachment. And you can see that by finding the antecedent of the conditional, I did not open my umbrella, noticing that that is the second premise, finding the consequent of the conditional, it is not raining, and comparing it to the conclusion of the argument, it is not raining. That is the correct structure for the law of detachment. So the conclusion is valid because this argument is the law of detachment, and the validity of an argument doesn't change if you replace a statement that it's logically equivalent to. I never proved that, but we're going to assume it. Let me say it again. The validity of an argument does not change if you replace it with a statement that it's logically equivalent to. I am 99% sure that is true, but what I'm 100% sure is true is the validity of an argument will not change if you replace a conditional premise with its contrapositive. which is what we did here. So what we've just done is we formed a second common argument form called the law of contraposition. And I want to focus on this original argument before we replaced the first premise with its contrapositive. So let's compare pieces here. Let's start by highlighting the antecedent in yellow and locating where that simple statement is again. It happens to be here, except it's negation. So how are we going to show negation? Let's highlight the word not in red so that the two yellows say that these are related, but the not says that this is the negation of it. And we'll do the same thing with the consequent, which we originally highlighted in green. And here's the consequent again, but once again, it's the negation of it. So visually, this is the form of our new law, the law of contraposition. If you have the first premise is a conditional, and the second premise is the negation of the consequent, and the conclusion is the negation of the antecedent, then your argument is valid, which is what we have written here symbolically. If the first premise is a conditional, and the second premise is the negation of the consequent, and the conditional is the negation of the antecedent, that's called the law of contraposition, and it is a valid argument without the need for a truth table. The law of contraposition also has a descriptive representation. In fact, I think I've said it at least twice already. First premise is a conditional, if some antecedent, then some consequent. But the second premise is the negation of the consequent, and the conclusion is the negation of the antecedent. The law of contraposition can be shown to be valid by showing its implication is a tautology. So we could do the truth table method, but you can also show it's valid by replacing the first premise with its contrapositive, a valid move since a contrapositive is logically equivalent to the original conditional. Realized I misspelled conditional there. It's going to bother me because I'm a little bit OCD like that. This transforms the argument into the law of detachment and hence is valid. Now, let me make it clear. You do not have to do what we did in this problem originally, which was to take the first premise, excuse me, I wanted that to disappear. You do not always have to do what we did originally, which was to take the first premise and rewrite it with its contrapositive. The only reason I did that was to illustrate that if we did, it would turn into the law of detachment and be a valid argument. So that's our justification for saying this. So we won't have to physically rewrite the contrapositive. We're saying because we can, this argument is valid. Let's try one. Determine if the following argument is valid. John said if he didn't win the election, then he would return to his former job of dog catcher. John didn't return to his former job, so I guess he won the election. Sounds like a reasonable conclusion to draw, and the law of contraposition says, yes, it is. Premise one, if John didn't win the election, then he would return to his former job of dog catcher. Here's the antecedent, and here is the consequent. Second premise, John didn't return to his former job. Now, is that the consequent? It is not. It's almost the consequent, so we'll highlight it in green. But it's the negation of the consequent because he said didn't. The consequent is he will return, and this statement is he didn't return. So it is the negation of the consequent. The conclusion I drew was, I guess he won the election, which looks a lot like the antecedent. The antecedent was he didn't win the election. The conclusion was he did win the election. Now, obviously the conclusion doesn't have the word not in it, so it doesn't look like a negation. But remember, negations can be formed one of two ways: by putting the word not in the correct place or removing a previously existing not. The original antecedent did have a not, and when we form its negation, that not gets removed and becomes John won the election. So yes, the conclusion is the negation of the antecedent, and the second premise is the negation of the consequent. Thus, this is the law of contraposition and is a valid argument. I want to do one more that's symbolic in nature, but we're not going to need the truth tables, because sometimes these laws are very stealthy, very disguised. If you were to look at this one, the first premise being the disjunction of P and Q pointing to the negation of R, and then the second premise being R, and then the conclusion being the negation of the disjunction of P and Q. Doesn't look anything like this, but it does look a lot like that. It may not be obvious, but let's scrutinize it to see if it matches a law, like the law of contraposition. Focus on the antecedent and the consequent of that conditional. Where else is the antecedent? It's down here, but notice that it picked up a negation. So the antecedent of the first premise and the conclusion of the argument are negations of each other. Now, look at the consequent of the first premise, the negation R. This premise is almost the same as that consequent, but the only difference is they are negations. In this case, the negation is up here, and when we form the negation, we removed the negation that previously existed. So it's a lot stealthier here, but structure-wise, this has the right structure for the law of contraposition. The conclusion of the argument is the negation of the antecedent. The conclusion of the argument is the negation of the antecedent. Again, the negation has to be on one or the other. And the consequent of the first premise is the negation of the second premise. The consequent of the first premise is the negation, is the negation of the second premise. So structurally, it's got everything it needs to have to be the law of contraposition. Very first thing matches the very last thing except negated. These two things match except negated. So our conclusion is valid by the law of contraposition. If you get hung up on letters and whatnot, you're going to get tripped up, especially when the argument is already presented symbolically. It's the structure of the argument, that what I call the descriptive representation. If you can nail that down, then you're home free. And to summarize, the law of contraposition is a valid argument form and has this symbolic representation and this descriptive representation.